Welcome to another online edition of Ebenezer Reformed Church's Video Sunday School. We've been considering what we can learn when we look at the New Testament letters, not so much for what they say, but for what kind of an example the authors are to us as they go about their work. And again, as I've said before, there's many different dimensions in which you could learn from their example. But the one that we've been particularly focusing on is the question of communication. And it then maybe should not have been a surprise that we got a little bogged down in Second Corinthians, and instead of working through it in one or two lessons, have been spending quite a fair amount of time in Second Corinthians. The reason for that, the reason it's such a gold mine of examples of communication, is that with regard to the Corinthians, Paul was locked into a bit of a tight spot. He was experiencing a lot of conflict with them. In First Corinthians, that was in large measure due to the fact that they had a lot of problems. There were many things that needed to be set right. In Second Corinthians, the situation has shifted a little bit. Some of what needed to be set right has been set right, but also now there's a certain amount of ill will or of suspicion, hostility even, towards Paul, and some of that is due to false teachers who had come among the Corinthians, and in order to gain more of a hearing for their doctrine, which was not in keeping with the Apostle Paul's, they had disparaged the Apostle Paul personally with regard to his character, and then also with regard to his ministry. Was his apostleship really as good as, say, that of Peter's? Was the gospel that he preached fully accurate in all points? Maybe he was one of those people who are pretty good on some things, but you really need to supplement them. All of that sort of thing was going on, and Paul now feels constrained to defend himself, to explain even his good conduct, as we saw last week. The fact that he didn't accept financial support from the Corinthians had somehow gotten turned into an additional club to beat him with. But then he comes to some of the attacks that have been made on his character or on his qualifications, and those things are not entirely separate. I mean, they're mixed up together, at least they were in this situation, and I think they often are in controversies where somebody's character and somebody's qualifications for the ministry may well come under assault at the same time. So in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 16, Paul says, I say again, let no one think me a fool. If otherwise, at least receive me as a fool, that I also may boast a little. What I speak not according to the Lord, but as it were foolishly, in this confidence of boasting. Seeing that many boast according to the flesh, I also will boast. For you put up with fools gladly, since you yourselves are wise. For you put up with it if one brings you into bondage, if one devours you, if one takes from you, if one exalts himself, if one strikes you on the face. To our shame, I say, that we were too weak for that. But in whatever anyone is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. Now, that's a little bit of a convoluted paragraph, and it's not necessarily easy to understand what's going on in it. The basic idea here is that Paul is feeling compelled or constrained to speak in a way that doesn't come naturally to him. He doesn't enjoy playing the fool, but he feels that he's been put into a situation where, in order to tell the truth, in order to be of use to the Corinthians, he's going to be forced to speak in a way that is not what he would prefer. He doesn't prefer to speak about himself in a boasting way. He doesn't prefer to parade his credentials in front of other people. He doesn't mean to show off. But if he's going to be criticized on the score of somehow being inadequate, if the truth of his doctrine is going to be called into question because of people making false allegations about his character or his history or anything like that, well then he will, for the sake of the gospel, defend himself, and he'll do so even though it's a little bit distasteful to him. Well, right there is a significant element or a significant principle that we can learn about controversy. It shouldn't be enjoyable. It usually is not. And there are things that come up, there are things that have to be done in controversy that we don't necessarily enjoy. It's good that we don't enjoy those elements, but that doesn't mean you can always avoid them. If you're thinking about it maybe in terms of bringing charges against somebody for heresy, well, many of us would not want to do that. You don't relish that. You don't look forward to that. You don't rub your hands together and crack your knuckles, waiting eagerly for the day when you get to file heresy charges against somebody. But if it needs to be done, it needs to be done. It's not anybody's preference. It involves a lot of work. It involves a lot of stress. It involves some sleepless nights. It involves all sorts of things that we would rather skip. But if it needs to be done, it needs to be done. And so Paul felt that he needed to speak in this way, even though it's not his preference, even though it feels foolish to him, but he will do so for the sake of the Corinthians, for the sake of the truth. Now, what he's going to talk about is that the allegations brought against him were false, were inadequate, were wrong-headed, turned things upside down. Now, that also is something that happens in controversies. It's something that happens in conflict, is that the truth gets stood on its head, and then that upside down version gets spread around as the truth. And so Paul is going to have to address this. And when he says, I speak not according to the Lord, but as it were foolishly in this confidence of boasting, he doesn't mean that he's saying anything that's untrue or that's inappropriate, but that under the pressure of controversy, he's adopting a tone, he's addressing subjects, and he's using a sardonic approach here that wouldn't necessarily be his first choice. He'd much rather be teaching doctrine, and yet here he is having to bring up his credentials because they've come under attack. But before he gets there, there's an interesting statement. Verse 19, you put up with fools gladly, since you yourselves are wise. Now, this again is a way to highlight the Corinthians' pride, and pride was at the root of a lot of the issues that they were having. In fact, Proverbs will say that only by pride comes contention. So often at the root of controversy or conflict of one kind or another, there is an element of pride. And in this case, the Corinthians' pride had made them more vulnerable to allegations that Paul was insufficiently qualified. If we could translate it into modern terms, they were saying, we need an apostle who has a PhD. We need an apostle with some academic credibility. He's got to be credentialed and re-credentialed and credentialed multiple times. In order to be good enough for us, that's kind of what we're looking for. So they had this pretension to wisdom, to sophistication in a Greek philosophical sense. But if that was true, if they were so wise, then they ought to be able to understand fools. They ought to be able to profit even from foolish speech, to get the benefit, whatever benefit there might be, to it. You put up with fools gladly. That's probably a reference to the false teachers. And if the Corinthians let the false teachers get away with being foolish, well, surely they can indulge Paul a little bit in some quote-unquote folly, in him being forced to behave in a way that was contrary to his preferences. Now, the description of the Corinthians as a proud people, as people who were proud of their wisdom, proud of their excellence, proud of their spiritual gifts, and so forth, then it hits us as a little bit incongruous. We're a bit surprised when Paul then goes on to say, you put up with it if one brings you into bondage, if one devours you, if one takes from you, if one exalts himself, if one strikes you on the face. To our shame, I say that we were too weak for that. What is that driving at? Well, if you wanted to summarize it, you would say, or you could say, that Paul is saying that they're accepting, they're tolerant of abusive behavior. You see, he's continuing to draw a contrast between his conduct among them and the conduct of the false teachers. Now, the false teachers came claiming wonderful credentials, and Paul will deal with that in a moment. But what was their conduct like among the Corinthians? Well, unlike Paul, the false teachers did take money from the Corinthians. Unlike Paul, the false teachers were not gentle among them. So you would think that all of these things would be advantage Paul. The Corinthians are more attached to him because he was gentle, because he was kind, because he was forbearing, because he was humble, because he was thoughtful in how he interacted with them, because he showed love and self denial at every turn. But that wasn't how it worked. In fact, the Corinthians are, at least some among them, are experiencing a significant preference for the false teachers over Paul. And it wasn't because the false teachers were better behaved, it was because they behaved with less consideration. And that's an odd little quirk, and yet we can see it play out in our own experience. Lots of people will follow somebody as long as that somebody is dogmatic and authoritative. One of the quicker ways to gain some popularity is to make a bunch of really polarizing statements. If you're gentle, if you're nuanced, if you're kind, sometimes that does not lead to anywhere near as much popularity, nearly as much clout as bombastic, overly dogmatic, and almost violent speech and behavior. Some of it may be that as a proud people, the Corinthians were used to looking down on others. And so when somebody came along who acted superior to them, they thought, oh, we better jump on that bandwagon. Oh, we better be involved with that person. This is the way to rise even higher up the social or intellectual scale. I think that was a significant part of the temptation because of what Paul has said to them before in First Corinthians, where he's emphasized the weakness, the foolishness of the cross and the preaching of the cross. You see, the gospel is not a message about how using worldly means you can gain more worldly success than other people who are in the world. Our message is about a Savior who was crucified. Our message is about a Savior who was shamed and disgraced. Our message is about a Savior who poured himself out for others, who sacrificed his very life in benefit of some of the people who had betrayed him, some of the people who nailed him to the cross. That was a very countercultural message. And in a Corinthian culture where power, authority, dominance was highly valued, Paul's humble, gracious, self-denying approach actually left him at something of a disadvantage. Now, I'm sure that that disadvantage was not true for everybody in Corinth. I'm sure that many people in Corinth appreciated Paul's character and his approach there, but there was definitely a contingent. They would they would respond with more loyalty, with more excitement, with more enthusiasm for somebody who belittled them, for somebody who talked down to them, for somebody who took advantage of them, than for somebody who set himself aside in order to serve them. And sadly, that has not ended. When what we value is defined, success is defined in worldly terms, when what we're looking for is who can take charge and bend other people to his will, then we're likely to follow somebody who's charismatic, who's intense, who's exciting, even if their behavior is objectively reprehensible. You think about all the people who went to Jonestown and wound up literally drinking the poisoned Kool-Aid. What happened in a situation like that? What happens in situations that maybe aren't that extreme, but that have certain points of contact with that? What happened in Corinth people wanted the strong man, or in Corinth, people wanted the sophisticated, the credentialed academic, and they were willing to put up with mistreatment in order to have that worldly gloss. They were not willing to embrace shame and disgrace and weakness in following Christ. And so when somebody came along in the name of Christ, but offering a better way, offering a more self gratifying, self flattering way, offering a way that made it seem like you can get ahead of all of the losers while still being a Christian, that was very attractive to those in Corinth who had a real problem with pride. Well, Paul says, to our shame, and he's speaking sarcastically there, I think that's pretty clear. To our shame, I say that we were too weak for that. Paul wasn't going to go down that road. Did it cost him some popularity? Did it cost him some heartache? Yes, it did. But that wasn't the point. The point was what was right, what was Christ-like. And so, although Paul will allow controversy and conflict to make him talk about things maybe he'd rather not talk about, to push him into being more sarcastic than maybe he'd be otherwise, to bring him to address things from a standpoint which is not congenial to him, controversy will make him do what's necessary. But not even controversy will push Paul beyond doing what's right, beyond being Christ-like. And so now he has to show his boldness, and he trots out his credentials. He does that in a very famous passage, verses 22 and following, where he can explain about himself that he's a Hebrew, he's an Israelite, he's the seed of Abraham, that he's the minister of Christ. Now, the false teachers and Paul were both making that claim about themselves. So he stacks up, he compares their ministry. Paul has labored more than they have. Paul has been persecuted more than they have, with stripes, that is to say, with beatings, with imprisonments, in deaths often, he says. I would imagine he means the danger of death. He talks about how from the Jews, 5 times he received 39 stripes. In other words, he was struck with a rod or a whip 39 times, and that happened on 5 separate occasions. Then 3 other times he was beaten with rods. He was stoned on one occasion. People threw rocks at him. He was shipwrecked, and he spent a whole day and night in the water before coming to land or being pulled out. Then you can talk about his journeys. You can talk about the dangers he's faced, whether it's danger of drowning, danger of robbers, dangers from his countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers in the sea, dangers among false brethren, maybe a little reference to some of what's going on right there, weariness, toil, sleeplessness, hunger, thirst, fastings, cold, nakedness, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation? If I must boast, I will boast in the things which confirm my infirmity. He appeals to God as a witness, that God knows he's not lying. He reminds them of how he had to escape from Damascus by being let down the wall in a basket, which is not a very dignified posture. What is Paul doing with all of that? He's saying, these are my credentials. He has the credentials of birth and education that the false teachers claim. In fact, he has more than that. But what's his real credential? His real credential, the real stamp of approval on his ministry, is that he hasn't stopped in spite of all the sufferings. He hasn't been discouraged. He hasn't been prevented from preaching Christ far and wide, even though he has been shipwrecked and stoned and had to escape from Damascus in a basket. Can the false teachers say that? Well, for us, that certainly provides a little bit of a reality check. It provides a reality check in terms of what we expect the Christian life to be. We shouldn't expect it to be one prosperity and brilliant success leading to another. We're following a crucified Savior. But it also provides a little bit of a reality check about what do we look for in our teachers and preachers? Do we expect that every I will be dotted, every T will be crossed, that their resume will look fantastic? Sometimes that happens, but not always. If Paul were writing a resume, he wouldn't get most of the jobs you might apply for with his resume. But he had a record, he had a proven record of faithful service to Christ, even when that came at the cost of tremendous difficulty. Even though it came at the cost of weakness. It sounds weak to have suffered all of these ways. He will boast in what concerns his infirmity. But he'll put that record of weakness and suffering up against the false teacher's record of popularity, of being able to take advantage of people, of being able to make people do what you want, of being able to smite people on the mouth when they don't live up to your expectations. Paul will take his record and he'll back that against the record of the false teachers any day. So as we look at that, as we think about that, and as we think, what do we learn from that? Well, I think we learn that in controversy, you sometimes have to do things you maybe would rather not do. That's one of them. I think you also learn that not even controversy should push you beyond the boundaries of Christ-likeness. And then I think that when it comes to that whole issue of pride, which is often a huge issue of contention, when we get involved in conflict, we don't want to seem inferior to the other person. In fact, we want to show that we're better than they are. We're more godly, we're more sanctified, we have a better understanding, or whatever it may be. We need to let that kind of thing go because of who we're following. What really counts is faithfulness in service to Christ. I'm not saying other things have no importance. Obviously, whether somebody's teaching accurately, truly, or not is a huge deal. And obviously, there are other things that enter into that. But faithful service, perseverance through suffering, is Paul's favorite credential for himself. If he's forced to talk about what qualifies him, perseverance in suffering was what qualified him. And of course, in other contexts, he would highlight the grace of God. But here it's specifically about comparing the record. Okay, we need to stop because this is getting a little bit long and there's still more to go. So we'll come back to 2 Corinthians next time. Until then, the Lord bless you.